Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Richard Lopes, and today I'm joined again by Dr. Vibeke Ottesen, and we're going to talk again about violence and crime from an evolutionary perspective. You can watch our two previous interviews on my channel. I'm leaving links to them in the description box of this one. So, Dr. Ottesen, welcome back to the show. It's always a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be back, and for a third time. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and for a third time, because actually there are still things to talk to talk about violence, human violence from an evolutionary perspective. I mean, there's a couple of things that we haven't touched on much, I guess, like, for example, if you take too much into account basically comparing humans to other animal species, and if you take evidence from animal models when trying to study criminology, basically. And we're also getting a little bit more into things like paternal filicide, maternal filicide, and also a little bit more on abortion, because last time we were having a great conversation on that topic, which is also relevant for these sorts of issues. I guess we're going to get into that. But yeah, let's start with other animals then. So is that something that you also consider in your research or in your work? I mean, do you look much into studies about violence in non-human animals, and which try to compare them to humans, or not?
I did as a student. As a student, I would read lots of studies pertaining to that, whether it was infanticide, war, intimate partner violence. I would read animal studies where they would also have the phenomena. And when you do find given phenomena like war, infanticide, or intimate partner violence in other species than humans, it undermines the argument that when humans perform this behavior, it's just a cultural construction, and so. And also you can identify through animal studies, cross-species studies, you can identify principles for the evolution of the phenomena. And to give one example, we're introducing a new character in this third episode, and that's my new puppy, who I got in February. He was 2 months then, so now he is 7 going on 8 months, and he's in the midst of puberty. Now, my latest study that I'm performing is on juvenile homicide offenders. Now, I'm not comparing my puppy to juvenile homicide offenders.
Yeah, I wouldn't imagine so.
Right now he's kind of gnawing at me, so it's tempting. But my point, long walk with me as always, but my point is that puberty is a very real biological phenomenon. It isn't just culturally constructed. It isn't something Hollywood made to make James Dean sell jeans back in the 1950s. Puberty is real, puberty exists, and it's a very specific, biologically speaking, it's a very specific time in the individual's life, and you also find that in cross-species. Mm-hmm. It's not just humans, it's not just my puppy, but you find it in a range of other species, this particular biological stage called puberty, and this. Because it's a specific biological period, you also it generates a specific psychology that generates very specific behaviors. Yeah. And what you find is that even in, say, something so evolutionary distant from humans as rats, even rats, when they are in their puberty, will engage in more risk behaviors in that period in life than any other period in their life. They will consume more alcohol in the presence of age pairs, just like humans. And so this isn't just something that humans do. And this is a relevant argument when I am going to consider juvenile homicide offenders and the specific biology and specific psychology that you get in puberty. So rather than assuming when you find a phenomena in cross species like this, you can then start to consider and explore and argue for there being a specific function for puberty. Yeah. Right now, as I'm fighting with my English Bull Terrier down here, it doesn't seem reasonable that evolution would have made this. But if you find it cross species, you have to actually see that there is going to be a function of it. Now, what my little puppy boy is doing right now is that he's testing who's the boss and what are the limits.
Yeah.
Also, he's driven by testosterone. So that's my very long answer to do I use animal models? I don't read a lot of those studies currently. Once in a while, I'll come across studies on how female hyenas kill the offspring of other females that are lower than them in the hierarchy, or yet another study showing that the female of a species will mate after a male has killed her offspring. And but I'm very careful with using that type of studies when I am writing about human child homicide. But I will say that both in my sample and in samples from other countries is that you will find human females who will stay in a relationship and have children with the man who killed their offspring. So you can use animal models, but it was more something that I did as part of my studies rather than something that I introduce the reader to in my articles. As we've spoken a lot about, evolutionary psychology is controversial. To use it on child homicide then is also controversial. But there is no doubt that these things have deep evolutionary roots.
But even though you don't use yourself too much evidence coming from cross-species studies, I guess, in your own work, how do you think we should go about comparing humans to other animals? Because, of course, to a certain extent, we should do it because there's biological continuity. But I guess that on the other hand, we should also be careful because there are tons of other species we could compare humans to. And then, I mean, perhaps some of them are sufficiently different that it doesn't make much sense to compare humans to them. And then also the closest species to us. I mean, there are at least two of them, chimpanzees and bonobos, that seem to be very different from one another in terms of in terms of their sociality, let's say, and how they deploy violence, how they establish relationships with one another and all of that. And that's what leads us to discussions surrounding precisely the evolutionary basis of human violence, because there are people that focus a lot on chimpanzees, and then other people bring bonobos to the table and say, okay, you should be a little bit more careful because we have two equally close species we should compare ourselves to, and they are not exactly the same. So what do you think about all that?
Well, I think I think animal studies should be part of methodology classes, research methods, but also then on how to use it, and also to illustrate the deep evolutionary roots of certain phenomena that therefore cannot be written off as merely cultural constructs, like that on the group averages between girls and boys with regards to how they play and the toys they play with, that you can find that in other species as well, that that have not been subjected to commercial cultures. So I think we should be teaching these things, and I think students should be allowed to explore these. But a part of it is also to identify general principles, rules of thumb. When these conditions, then this can evolve. And that's much easier to then use animal studies than human studies to make that argument, to find these general principles. Like one of the models that I do use is Robert Trivers' parental investment theory. And he goes through several different species to find the rules of thumbs. Now, I'm happy you brought up the chimpanzees, bonobo
dichotomy, let's say,
examples, because they are very often thrown out. You can't say that these violent tendencies in humans are a product of evolution because look at the bonobos. Well, yes, let's look at the bonobos. Their levels of violence are outstanding compared to human levels of violence. They are more violent than us. It isn't that every single conflict they have is resolved with sex or sexualized behavior, I should say. They are actually more violent than us. Their levels of violence is higher than the human species. So they aren't this. People who haven't read the studies on bonobos, they will often throw out that bonobos are an example of that humans have the potential to live in peace. The best example of humans having a potential to live in peace are humans. And what one does as an evolutionary psychology is, well, hopefully on undergraduate studies, one is introduced to and one does read animal studies. But then from that point, do as Robert Trivers and identify, well, what kind of pressures has the human species been under in their environment of evolutionary adaptation, and what is it that's formed us? I was in a discussion with a biologist at the University of Oslo a few years back, and he was quite boldly saying that one can't look at other animals to understand human infanticide, child homicide, because no other species has child homicide in the manner that humans have. Now, first of all, I'm not confident that he was as familiar with the characteristics of child homicide, certainly not to the extent as I am, seeing as I research it, and whenever I lecture on it, I always ask the audience what do they think is a typical child homicide in Norway, and they always miss. They always think that it's extensive violence that turns lethal, but it actually isn't. In Norway, the most typical child homicide is a suicidal father. And that has very different characteristics from these lethal beatings. And the only reason I could identify that was that because I used an evolutionary approach. And I did ask the question, what's so specific about human parental psychology? How will human parental psychology have evolved? So I disagree with this biologist. So when you use animal models, you can't just say, chimpanzees are like this, so humans will be like this. You can't say bonobos are like this, so humans will be like this. You can't say pubescent rats are like this, so humans will be like this. But you certainly should explore, is there anything cross-species here? And evolutionary psychology is a project on carving to the core of human nature and what are the specifics of selection pressure on our species, on our psychology, and how will it manifest.
Mm-hmm. And when it comes to how human violence differs from the violence that we see in other close species, again, like chimpanzees and bonobos, do you agree with Richard Wrangham when he distinguishes between reactive violence and proactive violence, and he says that the evidence points toward humans having evolved to be more proactively violent than other closely related species, but less reactively violent?
I have nothing but utmost respect for him. He's an incredible researcher, and he's an absolute role model in being educated in and being able to use different scholarly subjects and scientific fields. And his writing is so eloquent, and his arguments are so convincing. But in my research, which is mainly domestic homicides, and now I'm also researching juvenile homicide offenders, proactive and reactive, I don't use those categories. I'm interested in reproductive conflicts and reproductive crises, and what psychological mechanisms get triggered in those situations, and how a better understanding can improve our ability to prevent the triggering activation of these psychological mechanisms. And if they are triggered, how do we buffer? So I'm coming at it from a very different perspective than his. But he's, I would recommend all your viewers to read his work. Demonic Males, start with that, and then his latest book where he explores this even further, The Domestication of Humans. Very convincing argument. I know that he's provoked some researchers because he's downplaying female choice. He does discuss female choice in his latest book, but he doesn't really think that has been as influential on the domestication as more getting rid of the bad males.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. By the way, for the audience, I have an interview with Dr. Wrangham from early 2019 on the show, so whoever is interested in that, you can check that interview out as well. So, but I mean, sticking to your point of view and the place you come from, you still, and talking about crime, do you know, I mean, looking at how crimes occur and what motivates them and all of that, because I was thinking about the reactive / proactive distinction here. Of course, this is a very broad question, and perhaps it's not a very fair question, but just to introduce the topic, do we know how much of it is just something that occurs in the moment and is not really planned versus crime that is actually planned? And I'm talking about violent crime. I'm not talking about robbery or something like that. I'm talking actually about beating someone up or killing them. So how much of it is just something that happens in a moment because, I mean, people get too emotional or they have drunk too much or something like that, versus something that they plan?
Well, a lot of the violence and a lot of homicides historically and cross-culturally has been reproductive conflicts that have a sudden spur between two young males. Mm-hmm. That's characteristic of the non-domestic homicides. Non-domestic homicides are typically two young males in a dispute over something that can seem quite minor to anyone on the outside, but to the two parties, it's about honor and it's about respect and it's about status and resources, which has an evolutionary function than to want to solve it in a dramatic manner. But the domestic homicides, they are more planned, and certainly the ones that are extended suicides are more planned. They are more often planned, that the individual is more in a reproductive crisis than in a reproductive conflict as such, and in that crisis is trying to find solutions. and without the help of the surroundings, is left alone with very dark ideas and thoughts of that perhaps a suicide is a solution, and due to other feelings that have had an evolutionary function, they extend that suicide to include those they care for, like their children. These are more often planned, and they can be planned for months or weeks or days. And that's why I believe, and a highly motivating factor for me in my work is the potential to prevent the psychological mechanisms being triggered. But if they are triggered, how the village can buffer that triggering so as to prevent these extended suicides, homicide suicides, but also just suicides as well, because most suicides are not extended to include other victims. But these are often planned domestic homicides. Of course, the non-domestic homicides can also be planned. Those that are in association with a criminal lifestyle may often be planned. But the most typical homicide in human history is two males in a sudden dispute. You mentioned alcohol. It can lower impulse control. It can make some people more violent than what they'd be otherwise. But when it comes to domestic homicides, I lecture people who the police who investigate, or also have been given of the past couple of decades a role in preventing domestic homicides. They are very concerned with what about the role of alcohol and drugs. And I say that it looks to me, from reading all of these cases as I have, it doesn't seem as if the person is drunk and due to being drunk commits the homicide, as much as if you're going to kill someone you love, you might have to have Dutch courage, which is a silly expression for getting up the nerve by drinking alcohol. The non-domestic homicides can be influenced by alcohol, yes. Bars closing at the same time too early at night, if bars in one area closing at 1 o'clock, as they have been in Norway, just became a cesspool of potential violence and conflict. Whereas if you extend opening hours, there will be a trickle of people going home, and you don't have the masses coming out at once and then conflicts exploding. And they aren't planned. These and there the violence can by accident turn lethal.
Oh, that's very interesting. I never thought about that before. So if you leave bars open till later, then less crime tends to occur. Is that it?
Less of these violent conflicts, yeah, because people will be trickling going home. Some people will be going home at 1, some at 2, some at 3. But if everyone is let out at 1, like people like me will go home before 12. But younger people and young males will be wide awake and not ready to go home at 1 o'clock. There were streets in Norway, quite narrow streets with lots of places that would then close all at once. Everyone was out in the street at 1 o'clock, not ready to end the evening.
Yeah, actually here in Portugal right now it's not much later than 1 o'clock. It's 2 o'clock, so it's more or less the same time. But yeah, you mentioned something there that when you first mentioned alcohol, I was about to ask you. But yeah, then it seems that sometimes when people commit these types of domestic crimes, they might sometimes use alcohol to facilitate it. Is that it? I mean, because they've already planned it. They've already planned it, and then they drink to make it easier for them to go ahead with it.
I know I would. If I was going to kill someone I loved, it's, popular culture can give the impression that homicide is something that is done easily.
Yep.
It's not. It's not something that's done easily.
No, I mean, and I guess that one very good piece of data to support that is that even though we have those types of crimes, there's still very, very, very few people actually going ahead with it. I mean, actually committing those types of crimes, right? Because it's very hard. Unless I guess you're a psychopath, but that's just like less than 1% of the population or something, right?
A personality or a disorder can make you more vulnerable to perform violence, by different trajectories, such as, for instance, less empathy, but also a greater sense of entitlement.
And they're also more impulsive. Right.
Yeah.
Many of them, at least.
And a less of an ability to control emotions, which is then touching upon this whole, is it proactive, reactive thing, the impulsivity, but also the sense of entitlement and lack of empathy also.
Mm-hmm. And tell us a little bit more about that work you mentioned that you're doing on juvenile violence and crime. So, because I was, when you mentioned puberty, for example, the first thing that came to mind was, of course, hormones, testosterone in males particularly. But another thing that I thought about is, so our prefrontal cortices take up to around, at least as far as we know, 25 years of age to fully develop, and the prefrontal cortex is very important in terms of inhibiting behavior and self-control, impulse control, and all of that. So couldn't it be the case that that also plays a role? Because usually as men grow older, they tend to have more self-control. Right.
And prefrontal cortex is a part of that, which also you listed things accurately, but just adding also the ability to see consequences, long-term consequences for oneself and others. A teenager has a very short time span with regards to the future. Telling a teenager, "Oh, but think about your future," they live much more in the presence than old people like I do. So yeah, that absolutely is a part of it. But there's it's yes, the prefrontal cortex, and yes, hormones. I mean, there's this quote when I was reading your questions, and you were listing in your email that you were going to ask me about animal models. Yeah. And yes, I am working on juvenile homicide offenders right now, and it just came to mind the idea of animal models. This it was in The Guardian I read a couple of years ago. This fantastic quote which summarizes puberty across species. It's about wombats, an Australian animal. As babies, they're clingy, they're adorable, they're with mum 24 hours a day, they're in a soft, snuggly sleeping bag all the time, listening to a heartbeat, Lind told the Canberra Times. When they start to mature and hit puberty, they just hate everybody and everything. They go from running between your legs and cute as a button to being absolute little, can I swear, little shits. They nip you, they wreck, they bite. I won't look after wombats because you kiss goodbye to your flooring and everything. They just destroy everything. And as we've been talking, my little boy has been destroying everything and is currently now attacking my trousers. There's so much going on, so much biology creating a psychology that means that when a juvenile homicide offender has done the most extreme action any human can take, regardless of age, is in the courts. And the courts are laws, court procedures, everything is constructed for adults and what the law calls the rational man. In puberty, no animal, human, non-human, they're not rational. My little boy right now is not being rational. And human teenagers are not rational either. So they're actually an incredibly vulnerable time in their lives where what I see in the societal debates in Norway, and I also see in the courts and in media, is that they're horrified that a child can commit homicide, but actually they are so vulnerable with regards to their brain's development, with regards to the hormones, and the significance that the presence and their social presence has for them, that I disagree with holding teenagers, human teenagers, to the standards of the rational man. And in courts, of course, they are meeting forensic psychiatrists who do a forensic evaluation of them, a jury, judges that are all like, they are middle class, upper middle class, white, and have lived very different lives from these teenagers, both in Norway and as in the States. One sees that these were children who should have been taken better care of, and we didn't. So they are highly vulnerable, and there's like this shock that a child can commit homicide. Well, yes, certainly. Consider how extreme their biology is, and then consider how extreme some of their lives are.
Yeah, and I would imagine that also when it comes to human adolescent males, I mean, there's that combination of less self-control that probably derives a lot from higher levels of testosterone, combined with the fact that the prefrontal cortex is not yet fully developed. And also, I mean, because of the risk-taking behaviors, there's also something else that adds to the picture here when it comes to creating sort of an explosive recipe for being even more violent. That is, I mean, it's also easier for them to have less control when it comes to alcohol intake and drug intake and all of that, right?
Yeah, again, I'm not really seeing drugs and alcohol as the triggering, eliciting of the homicide. Again, I'm not seeing that Norwegian material. What I'm seeing is reproductive conflicts and reproductive crises, and that the social setting, the life there, the extreme life conditions that these teenagers are in. So far, the only thing that surprised me in this sample actually has been the number of females. But again, the lives of these people.
The number of females who also commit this type of crime, is that it?
Yeah, female juvenile homicide offenders. There were more than I thought there'd be. There is still an overrepresentation of males, but both females and males, it isn't they got drunk and then they killed someone. They are they have lived lives with many of them abuse and neglect, and they are reacting to that abuse and neglect, or they are in a social setting where adults just don't seem to understand the significance that your social life and social status has as a teenager. Again, I repeat, there's a function to having this biology. There's a function to the psychology. There's a function to having the type of behaviors that you get. And there's a reason for why your social life is so important as a teenager. There are studies showing that being excluded and bullied by age peers is experienced as worse for a teenager than being subjected to domestic abuse and neglect. So I think it's starting to trickle in also in Norwegian courts. It's starting to trickle in the fact that, hey, their biology is different from ours, and hey, maybe their psychology is different from ours. But there's still a lack of appreciation of that, hey, their social lives are different from ours. But it makes evolutionary sense. The function of adolescence and having puberty is finding your position in your tribe. And when that position is being threatened, or you don't have legal ways to achieve it, you get a reproductive conflict or crisis. So some of your viewers will be thinking, I'm really downplaying drugs and alcohol here. And I'm like, yeah, because I don't see the evidence.
I mean, on that point, just to be clear, perhaps when I mentioned drugs and alcohol, I was maybe not referring exactly to homicide, but just
lifestyle,
violent behavior in general. Like, I mean, just the usual stuff of, for example, being at a party and drinking too much and getting into a fight or something like that, something more in the moment and more impulsive, let's say, and that does not usually lead to someone dying. So,
yeah, certainly, and even more severe with regards to that, letting teenagers, young people, party without having adult chaperones, then yeah, there's an excessive use of alcohol, an excessive use of drugs. Like I said, even rats who are in puberty will drink excessively when there are age peers there.
yeah.
Then there are adults there or younger there, or there's a mix, doing different type of experiments. It's when you have a gang of teenage rats, they drink excessively. And so you'll get that with humans. But another thing, which is very troubling, is then also the occurrence of rape.
Yeah. I was missing that. Yeah, that's true.
Which I consider a violent and sexualized crime. The whole, the victim being intoxicated and therefore not in a position to avoid this rape and being taken advantage of.
And by the way, you mentioned there also females, and I was wondering, and you also mentioned some of the, let's say, environmental / contextual risk factors behind this type of crime. Are these risk factors similar to both males and females, or do you find some differences there?
Well, predictably, both a male and a female needs to be cared for, whether it's by parents or the village.
Yeah.
So both female and males are reacting to not being cared for. But in probably both, but I certainly remember the first interview that we did, I mentioned Anne Campbell. Unfortunately, the late Anne Campbell, a brilliant evolutionary psychologist who wrote on female violence and female crime. And in particular, then her article Staying Alive from, I believe, 1999. But the article is called Staying Alive. And the massive selection pressure that's been on females to stay alive due to their compulsory physiological role as primary caregivers by being pregnant, gestating for 9 months and then breastfeeding in hunter-gatherer societies up to 4 years. And there's then selection pressure on them to stay alive to an extent that hasn't been on men. So women in general are exposing themselves to a lesser extent to physically dangerous situations, and initiating a homicide is, of course, rather dangerous because the victim might be successful in protecting itself. And so, which is why the number of females was a surprise. It isn't. Now, there are not that many cases. I'm going to wait with telling you how many until I've published, but there are not that many cases. But there were, a few more female. But that just shows how extreme their life circumstances are. Because it will take more for a female to go to that step. So when a female does go to that step, that's a reflection of how caregivers and the village have really let this female child down and not protected her against these extreme circumstances that then push her to this very desperate solution, because no one is helping her to find another solution. Because when it's a matter of juveniles, teenagers, I do believe it's caregivers and the village who has a greater responsibility than the child itself, because we know from animal studies and human studies, we know that their biology and therefore their psychology and therefore their behavior is different from an adult's. We have a greater responsibility.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've just recently actually had on the show or released an interview with Dr. Frederick Totes from the Open University in the UK, and we talked about sexual serial killing. Of course, that's not the same as what we're talking about here, but just to mention that, I mean, I don't think that there should be anyone out there among these people, either sexual serial killers or people who just kill one person once. It's just a one-shot thing, let's say, who haven't had horrible lives growing up. I mean, I don't see any examples of people who had like very good, a very good childhood and adolescence, growing up and committing those sorts of crimes.
If they do, there will be a certain biology there that will create it. Like there are cases. I can't remember his name. I believe it was an American case of a guy who'd led an ordinary life and then suddenly got violent fantasies. I believe he killed his ex-wife and then several other people and then got shot. And then they did an autopsy and found a brain tumor. Now this isn't just an urban legend. It's in one of the psychology textbooks where I've been teaching in the biology of personality. Mm-hmm. But I have in my sample of juvenile homicide offenders a case where I was a forensic expert on homicide in the court case. The courts were so horrified by this teenage boy who had committed a double homicide, but as one didn't learn through media, and you couldn't really read from the verdicts, but what I learned in that case was that he'd actually been suicidal for a few years, been untreated, undiagnosed, untreated, and therefore not given any help for depression and suicidal behaviors. And there was then in this, as I keep repeating, to him as a teenage boy, the reproductive crises and reproductive conflict that he was with his first victim was so extreme that he couldn't handle it on his own. And there's no reason to believe there was anything wrong with his family life or anything like that. But the conflict and crises that he found himself in as a teenage boy with a teenage biology, he just couldn't handle it on his own. So you do have, but he wasn't, like you say, like a serial killer. No, that's something very different.
Yeah, and it's extremely
no to being a serial killer.
Yeah, and it's extremely rare. I mean, if homicide is rare, this is even rarer.
I mean, some in your audience will probably be watching true crime shows. And if you do that, if you watch true crime shows, you might get the impression that, you know, you can't get on a bus without there being a serial killer there. But it is actually quite extreme. And to studies, to have a big enough sample, you need like large populations, like you need to get samples from the States, from India, Of course, you only hear about serial killers in the States or Germany, but they exist all over the place. But you need a huge population to find that one person who has that sort of biology, that gives that sort of psychology, that gives that sort of behavioral tendencies, because it is not a species typical behavior, serial killing. It's not.
No, I have to tell you, when I was an adolescent, I loved watching crime shows, but now, I mean, I can't stand it. It's just it's just too much and too silly. I mean, first of all, if you watch them, you get the idea that if you just walk out on the street, you might get killed anytime, and that the crime rate is just, I don't know, 80% or something like that.
Like villages in the English countryside.
Yeah.
And also you get a very skewed idea of the resources that the police have.
That's the other thing, the other point I was going to make. I mean, it's so frustrating to watch those shows nowadays, because it's like they mobilize the entire police force to try to catch a guy who committed homicide or something like that. That's already very unrealistic, but then they have all sorts of completely ridiculous advanced kinds of technology.
Oh, yeah.
And they waste all of those resources trying
Yes.
to catch one single. I mean, come on. It's
Exactly.
like Dr. House on steroids or whatever.
I mean, most police districts would be happy to get a whiteboard or a functioning internet. And also you get the impression that the police are continuously using eccentric and sexy profilers.
Yeah.
They are not continuously using sexy and eccentric profilers with troubled romantic lives. On occasion, I will be a consultant to the police here in Norway when they have cases where the ones investigating the homicide are just... Well, they're struggling. They're struggling with that. Would a mother do this? Why would a mother do this? Can we claim that the mother would actually do something like this? Looking back on the cases I've been involved with, there's a clear overrepresentation of me being called in as a consultant in these cases when it's maternally perpetrated filicide. I don't have as many examples of when it's a paternally, when a man has committed the homicide or the severe violence that they're investigating. And I fear that the police might just think that, oh, well, men are violent, no problem imagining that he's done this. And then when confronted with a mother doing it, but having a culturally constructed idea of that women are not violent when women absolutely are when it comes to their children. Like I said, and Campbell's argument was the whole staying alive, not initiating the violence that could endanger the perpetrator, the female perpetrator. This is then no longer an issue, is it, when the victim is a child? An adult woman will be successful compared to the victim in one of those situations. So I'm just worried, and I write a bit on this in my work, on how women have been pathologized, that a woman must be pathological if she's perpetrated filicide, but not necessarily. It's all depending. It's an assumption that needs further qualification, because there is a systematic difference on those perpetrators who do have some sort of psychopathology versus those that don't.
Mm-hmm. And by the way, since we're talking about the media, one thing that really bothers me, and even more so than the crime shows, because I mean the shows are fiction, whatever. I mean they might influence the culture to some extent, but I don't worry too much about that. But what I worry more about is the ways people on the news many times go and look for a crime committed in an isolated place that was really horrifying, and then the way they portray the crime on television, and even more than that, because again, it gives people the wrong impression that there's lots of crime going around there everywhere. But also, I mean, it is really unfortunate that sometimes what that leads to is that the suspect is already sort of being considered the actual perpetrator in public before he or she was properly judged in court and gone through trial. Because I think that's really bad. Because if the person is, the suspect is actually not the person who committed the crime, her or his reputation is already tarnished. Right?
Yes, absolutely. We've just had a case in Norway where the guy sentenced for, and it's a really, really horrific crime. 2 little girls were brutally killed and raped.
Yeah.
And the police went after 2 young men. And after 20 years, one of them is now acquitted.
Yeah.
And he's lived his life as just being like referred to a prototype, the most horrible human being on earth.
Yeah.
And he wasn't. But that's his life then completely ruined. I mean, he's out now. He's in his 40s, but the media and the police were too quick to conclude that he was the one. And although I don't like true crime shows, I don't, and I'm in media doing interviews on homicide about once a month since 2008 or something like that. But I won't do any interviews with true crime because I don't think that these shows, they too easily can make entertainment out of something so horrific. And I don't like that. I don't think people should seek that as entertainment. But also a true crime show. Now, they were helpful towards his acquittal in Norway, this last case I'm talking about. But you don't know at the outstart of a true crime show, documentary, podcast, what have you, if they will be able to pinpoint truth any better than the police were back in the day. And they might also, in a true crime podcast, then acquit someone or place guilt on someone where that might not be correct either. Mm-hmm. So the news can do it. True podcasts can do it, and I think the audience needs to be considerably more critical, but also media needs to be more critical. And so far, I'm just comforted by knowing that the police are taking it more and more seriously. But I'm also waiting for media to take it equally as serious, and these true crime, both those producing it and those being entertained by it, to also take it more seriously. It's hard to know the truth in these.
But I mean, I don't know if you agree with me on this or not. But I guess that most of the responsibility should be on the media and not so much on the audience. I'm going to explain why. Because, I mean, first of all, the media is already portraying a suspect as a perpetrator. I mean, many times that happens. They're not very subtle in the way they expose information. And also, I mean, so people get exposed to that piece of news of someone who committed murder or supposedly committed murder or someone who raped another person, for example. And then, I mean, what are people going to do? They see that on the news, they comment on it with other people, and then people just have to like condemn the person who is presented as a suspect because I mean I don't know if you ever tried this, but I now and then get into discussions with people when something like that happens, and if I just try to say something like, wait a minute, he's just a suspect, we're not sure, I'm already a rape apologist, an homicide apologist. I mean, you know what I'm talking about, right? So
I do. Now,
and I guess that to some extent I understand that reaction from people because we're dealing with something that is very serious, and the television and the news is talking about a specific person as being the person who is basically associated with that crime. And I mean, the first instinct is just to condemn that that person because that's what you do in human society, right?
you're absolutely right. And so, yes, in other words, I absolutely agree with you. Yeah, first and foremost, it is those who actually produce these shows, documentaries, podcasts. But I'm still going to claim that you have some consumer responsibility to be critical. That you can choose to watch the shows that are more humble and less sensationalistic, and the problem is that these shows are being made because the audience uncritically and with glee, morbid glee, are consuming and watching these. But I still want to hold consumers responsible. I do. I want to hold them responsible, and I want them to be more like you and say, hang on, wait a minute. My best friend and I, with that case from Norway where he was just recently acquitted, my best friend, she won't necessarily come to any of my lectures, and she won't necessarily read any of the interviews I do. She hasn't watched any of these YouTube interviews I've done with you, and she won't watch this third one, and so I can out her here.
Oh my God. Don't get me into legal issues.
No, but she'll watch true crime podcasts, also knowing that her best friend doesn't like them and is qualified in arguing for why you shouldn't watch them. She will watch them. And so she was convinced that this guy who recently was acquitted, that he was actually innocent. And all I had to say to her was, hey, you have now seen the defense, but you don't know what the police did have of evidence against him. So this should be tried in courts, and it shouldn't be tried in media where you only get his defense. To which, when he was acquitted, she had then interpreted me as saying that he was guilty. I hadn't said anything. What I say was, I don't know. So I've been in your situation where it's like, hang on, wait, we don't really know. We're being presented by either the court's very strong argument for only listing why he's done it, and then media listing why he hasn't done it. And we don't know. We have to be more humble and critical as consumers. But yeah, no, she took that as evidence for that I believed he was guilty. But the thing is, I have no idea. I used to be a prison researcher before I was a homicide researcher. I did prison research, and I was at the prison, quite a bit at the prison where he was serving his indeterminate sentence, but never met him because he was never up for meeting a researcher. So these are real lives that either, that are being portrayed as one or the other. And also there are I think also I should bring into our conversation here how this is then for the people who are bereaved and left behind.
Yeah.
How it is for them to watch. They aren't necessarily watching these true crime podcasts and shows and
another another thing that I sometimes find really bad that people do on the media is that they try and sometimes even force a little bit interviews with, for example, the family and people
Yeah.
like that, which I think, I mean, come on, that's
Yeah.
too much, right?
Yeah, it is. It is too much. And yeah, one has to consider them also as both those who are initiating these projects, producing, making these projects, but also I'm still arguing for a critical consumer, that if they, before you watch this show, this podcast, whatever, have the bereaved been involved in any way in making it? Have they had any kind of reaction to it? Because the end of my argument earlier was that they're not necessarily watching these shows or listening to these podcasts, but they are watching their surroundings with morbid glee, discussing and watching and being entertained by the rape and murder of their loved ones.
Yeah.
So,
And by the way, since we are on this topic, also something, and now, to be fair, I'm also granting you the point that to some extent that we should also, I mean, the consumers should also hold some responsibility. I mean, for example, one thing that really bothers me is, for example, here in Portugal, when someone commits a crime, for example, there's an homicide in a small village. They usually go there, the reporters, and they ask the neighbors, for example, and usually, most of the time, what most neighbors say is something along the lines of, "Oh, he was such a nice person." I mean, they don't usually say anything bad about the suspect. And then the way people react to that, the viewers and all of that, they usually say, "Oh, they are just hypocrites," blah blah blah. And I'm like, what? Wait a minute. Why? Why are they hypocrites? I mean, can't you imagine? Okay, let's suppose that that person actually committed the crime. Okay, let's suppose that's true. Start with that. But even if that's true, how hard is it for you to imagine that someone can deal with different people in different ways, right? And have different sorts of... I mean, someone who commits a crime is not killing the 100 people around them. They're just killing one person. So if they were... I mean, usually polite to 99% of people around them, that's just to be expected. I mean, they're not lying. The other people are not lying. They're just saying that when it comes to the kind of relationship they had with them, it was just fine. Right?
Exactly. No, this is something I've also been reacting to for years. I mean, when I first started researching domestic homicides back in 2008, it would be very little media coverage, and there was like. Media was very, very careful with these cases, and in Norway, most domestic homicides are extended suicides or part of or performed in a psychotic episode, and so media were very careful. But like over the past 10 years, it's the whole media circus comes to this tiny village in some unknown fjord where there's been a domestic homicide, and immediately start interviewing neighbors. Why? What can they tell? They will in Norway also say, surprise, surprise, "Oh, I'd never thought that of Bob." Well, no, it's just like you said. Why would you think that of Bob? He was your neighbor. He wasn't your husband who you were going through a divorce with right now.
Yeah.
So his conflict and crises wasn't surrounding you. You're Bob's neighbor. You're not his ex-wife. So what I've been criticizing media for doing this is that the best you can learn from an interview with neighbors is the whole, yeah, no, domestic homicides can actually happen in absolutely every single neighborhood.
Yeah.
Domestic homicides don't just happen in big cities, like capital cities, like in Norway, Oslo. Domestic homicides will happen wherever there's a man or a woman going through a reproductive crisis or conflict. That's where you'll get it. And that can happen in any neighborhood, even in Norway. Actually, in particular in Norway. In other countries, like in the States, in the UK, in South Africa, you will have neighborhoods with higher rates of crime. And with the higher rates of crime, you'll have higher rates of homicides. But a domestic homicide, that can happen in any social class. And it can therefore happen in any neighborhood, and therefore can happen anywhere in Norway. And that's the best you can learn from an interview with a neighbor. But it's the media circus making entertainment out of it. And again, consumer responsibility seems to evaporate in this morbid interest.
No, before we move on to another topic, let me just say what we're talking about here is very serious, but someone should do a comedy sketch about some of these things, because I mean, you go to you go to the village and you interview the baker, the dentist, the priest, the undertaker. I mean, what do they have to do with that, man? Come on, really?
Yeah, I think it's much better to just call an expert on homicide and ask them about the questions like, are the particular neighborhoods, can neighbors detect? But yeah, no, they're continuously going for these neighbors, and it makes me worried about what is the next step, because media just over the years has become, in Norway, has become more and more, when they're not treating it with the same serious tone that they used to, it's becoming more sensationalist and like covering it for the sake of covering it, rather than actually having an important message to the public with their coverage, which is the precise reason why I do interviews. When a homicide has occurred, I will do an interview for the sake of educating the population in Norway as a whole, but also in that village of, because in the absence of professionals, scientific based information, people have their own ideas, and they might be very wrong.
And by the way, going back to one of the topics that we explored in our first interview when we talked, for example, about the work done by Dr. Martin Daly, and I'm asking you about this again because actually it is an issue that we are going through right now, particularly in the most developed countries, and with the current cost of living crisis, for example, and inflation and all of that, I guess it's probably even worse. To what extent, I mean, how important is the role of economic inequality? How much of a role does it play in this type of crimes?
Well, one has known for decades that when it comes to the general levels of crime, which then give an associated increased then also level of non-domestic homicides, we know that it isn't just rich versus poor. It's the individual's experience of relative depravity, relative poverty. So now we also have, there's more information available and from social media, from news, that's influencing the individual's perception of, well, how poor am I relative to others? What are my chances of obtaining resources and the status and etc. To achieve this with legal measures versus non-legal measures. that will influence young people. But we also know, like the young male syndrome that Martin Daly wrote on together with his late wife,
Margot Wilson. Yeah.
And there's another thing we also know, that it's both it's the relative experience, and that it's the experience more than the actual level of poverty versus middle class versus those 1% rich. So it's not just actual rates, it's also the perception of where media and social media will be influencing the individual. But we also know that it's not necessarily the individual's actual or experienced relative poverty here and now, as much as what signals was the individual picking up as a child. Mm-hmm. So right. Children growing up in poverty is going to be a bigger problem than young men in poverty. So we know that. When it comes to domestic homicides, well, we know that for instance, when it comes to intimate partner homicide, child homicide, familicide. Familicide is when you both commit the child homicide and kill a current or former partner. Losing your ability to provide for your family has a massive influence on the male psychology. You know, having the ability to provide, but then losing that ability can make a man perform this extended suicide. So when Norway shut down during the pandemic, there were a lot of people, including my neighbors, who were claiming, well, now there'll be a lot of homicides because the country shut down. Because they had an idea of domestic violence causing the homicide. Mm-hmm. And they also had an idea of the more time you spend with your family, you're more likely to hit them. Now, this is unqualified. It's very dark that mere time spent with family will make you both hit them and kill them. That's pretty dark, yeah. And it isn't supported by any evolutionary perspective of human nature at all. So I said that it's actually not going to be a problem with the country closing down, because with the country closing down, it removed the social and financial ability women had to leave relationships they didn't want to be in. That prevented intimate partner homicide. Now, I'm analysing Norway. This might have had completely different effects in other countries, but my knowledge of the phenomenon and of Norwegian society made me say, no, you won't have an increase in child homicides, and certainly not intimate partner homicides. You won't. The problem will be when the country opens up. When the country opens up, women will again be taking out divorce and leaving relationships they don't want to be in. And all the financial help, because Norway was brilliant with regards to helping people out financially, people who had businesses that were feeling a detriment to the country being closed down. It was the government decided that the country should close down. So it was government that was causing a lack of income for them. And so the government took the responsibility they actually had and financially helped these businesses, which means that men were able to support their families and keep the families during lockdown. Yeah. But when society opened up again, there was no more financial help, and women were again able to leave. And that's when I said that now we have to do the job of being there for each other, and help families going through these financial crises and breakups. So that's how I analyze the Norwegian situation. Now, this might be different in other countries, because you also saw in other countries, I know there was an increase in violence, whereas in Norway, there was actually a decrease in women getting in touch with the police. Mm-hmm. And that can be, my analysis of Norway was that men who use violence to control their partners already had the control of the partners of the lockdown in itself. So the women were always at home. They could control them at home, and it didn't trigger men to control these women by violence. And also, intimate partner homicide was also prevented.
Mm-hmm. But by the way, Just to try to understand a little bit better from an evolutionary perspective, the mechanisms that are operating here. So when a man who is married, for example, loses income, his income goes down, or worse than that, loses his job, becomes unemployed. I mean, the fact that sometimes, not every time, of course, but sometimes some of them become violent toward their partners, their spouses. Does that have anything to do with their self-perceived mate value going down, or?
Apart from that, they're not consciously perceiving it. But yes, we talked about this last time. Words like strategy and perception, how they're used by non-evolutionary scholars and the general public, is that yes, they are perceiving it, but not consciously perceiving it. But it is triggering psychological mechanisms of a need to up the control of their partners. Because it's a fact their mate value is declining. But also, and I write about this because it's not just about their mate value, it's about a genuine, evolved motivation for men to provide. They genuinely want to provide for their dear ones.
And in that particular case, perhaps their self-esteem also goes down more generally, not just their self-perceived mate value.
Yeah, but those are closer associated than the...
Yeah, sure. I guess that there are many factors that would play into self-esteem, and that would be one of them.
But I'm arguing for something that I'm hoping will elicit more empathy and sympathy in the general public, because it's the general public who has to buffer for the triggering of this, and that is men genuinely want to provide for the families, and the pain and darkness associated with not being able to provide for your family. I think we need to be more sympathetic to, I think we need to be more aware of it, and I think we need to be more sympathetic to this being very real feelings, because it can also not necessarily lead to extended suicides, but the singular suicide. In Norway, our population is just over 5 million, and we have about 600 suicides a year. And more than...
By the way, is it right that Norway and perhaps another country in Scandinavia are among the countries in the world where suicide rates are the highest, along Japan, I guess?
As far as I know, the suicide rates in Norway are they don't stick out in any.
Okay. So perhaps I read these somewhere that was not very. Perhaps it was an untrustworthy source, I guess.
But the Finns, I know that in the Scandinavian Nordic countries, that the Finnish have higher rates of suicide, and one doesn't know why, and they also have higher rates of homicide, and we don't know why. Of course, that's changed over the past, say, 5 years or so with the crime rates, and along with the crime rates, the associated homicide rates between young men in certain parts of Sweden. But prior to that, Finland had both more homicide suicides and homicide suicides than the other Nordic countries, and one didn't know why. There were studies looking at the quality of the drinking water. There were studies looking at ridiculous studies looking at the level of reading newspapers, which is just a classic case of So that's then a classic case of association, correlation, not cause effect. But no, Norway's not particular in with regards to suicide rates. I don't believe so. No, no. But my point is there's another side to male domestic violence that I don't think has been given enough attention, consideration, and humane approach, and that is the real crises that a man can experience. These days, I'm currently writing a text on homicide, suicide from evolutionary perspectives, where I'm bringing to the foreground the concept of reproductive crises. Even though Daly and Wilson were spot on with the hypothesis of reproductive conflict, but I think from an evolutionary perspective we need to give also more attention to the crises, which then it's a different type of psychology being triggered, and therefore you will have different characteristic traits of the perpetrator, victims, circumstances, methods, and in turn, ultimately, you'll also then have to have different approaches to prevention and buffering.
Mm-hmm. And also, and since we're talking about economic inequality here, more on the side of economics/politics, I guess that many times people also underestimate how hard it is to be poor and to live poverty. I mean, because the problems usually pile on top of each other. I mean, you are poor, you can't pay rent, you can't pay for food. Perhaps you might to try to cope with things. Perhaps you might develop some nasty addictions that are really, really hard to treat. And I mean, even without that, it's not easy at all to live poverty. Right.
And then evolution has created that very special biology and psychology of young male, which Daly and Wilson introduce in the young male syndrome, where they explain that when you are in those circumstances, and then you get presented with, okay, so legal measures of getting out of poverty are not available to you. Mm-hmm. And then someone introduces the illegal. What young man will say no to?
Yeah, that's true.
And then for, white middle-class male who's had a great life to say, I still think he should have taken the moral high road. Yeah, cool, but you're not there and you've never been there. And again, this doesn't mean that you and I think that it's just, it's a brilliant option for young men, do something illegal instead.
No, not at all. I wouldn't recommend that.
Wouldn't recommend it. There's a difference between explaining it and accepting it. Mm-hmm. And so, as a homicide researcher, when I am, lecturing and doing interviews and being a consultant, and I'm giving a humane spin on something that has often been written off as men are evil and violent and they're all horrible, and instead I'm coming with a very different take on it. And maybe if your viewers haven't seen any of the two previous interviews, you might be quite shocked by my attitude here, but I think one has tried writing men off as violent and horrible for centuries and not been very successful. So maybe try a different approach, which has scientific theory and empirical evidence to support that there can be different psychological mechanisms being triggered, causing these behaviors, and with a humane response you might not have it triggered, and if it's triggered you can buffer that activation. And the Nordic countries have had a policy on many different areas that have ultimately led to lower crime rates and associated lower homicide rates than other countries, and has therefore been a very successful natural experiment in how to prevent these things, much better than other countries that have been given more attention, such as, for instance, the States or the UK, which have had more of a punitive and withholding on welfare, and it hasn't worked. And now, of course, you have the Ghana natural experiment of Sweden, where there are so many young men who have grown up in relative poverty, absolutely perceive that they have that, do not perceive that they have a legal measure to, the level of status that they want, because they are young men and they are therefore driven and ambitious. It's just that becoming a doctor or a lawyer just doesn't seem realistic to them. So they're using these illegal measures, which is then crime. And associated with that kind of lifestyle is homicide. And that's what we're seeing in Sweden. So having a global perspective and seeing how different societies can create crime levels, and when we do that, how do we respond, is very telling of human nature.
Yeah, and I mean, as you mentioned before, of course, we are not here to recommend any of that,
No.
but at the same time,
Recommend legal measures.
yeah, but at the same time, I have to say, if the state and the collective does not provide these people with good enough resources and opportunities to leave poverty, what are you going to do? I mean, if you want to keep on living, I mean, if you don't want, that's another issue, but if you want to keep on living, I mean, you have to earn money in some way, right? And unless you want to like steal or something like, but that's still crime. So you have to sustain yourself. Right?
Yeah. And also, young males want to go beyond just sustaining themselves. Young men are driven, but like I just said, not all young men, not all 14-year-old boys see becoming a doctor or a lawyer accessible to them, and then they get introduced to, well, you can do this and that, and it's illegal, but you'll get, fast money and status. So young boys are extremely vulnerable to living in a society where they're not perceiving having legal options. So we have to create societies where they perceive legal options, and it's not just a false perception, but that it's actually true. I mean, that's why so many African Americans were, above and beyond. I mean, yes, they had Obama who was representing them, but they were also talking, when they were saying he represents us, they were also considering how he represents a real life example of what a young African American can achieve. That they need these role models. So role models, but also that the structure is there. Like, one of the things that makes social mobility, if you're born into poverty, to get out of poverty, one of the things that creates a social mobility in Norway is that all education is more or less free. Like, it's a very symbolic student fee to go to Norwegian universities and colleges. So it's accessible for everyone. And also you have government-run student loan, which is just common, like everyone has it kind of thing. And these things have worked towards that, maybe your parents haven't gone to university or college. If you're an immigrant family, your parents have maybe not gone to university or college, but you can. And you're presented in the Norwegian society that this is a realistic opportunity for you to make a career, etc. But the problem with social minorities is that it isn't just a perception, it's very real. Like when you live in a family and you see your parents struggling financially and you see that it's hard for people like you to get a place to live, etc. There's a lot of alienation towards society as well. So there's a lot of levels to work on if you want to get crime rates down, and one can only hope that Sweden finally realizes that they have to go about this very differently to present the young men in their society with a perception of realistic options, because that's not happening right now. And it's also then therefore the situation of any country on earth that has a social minority, the young males there are very vulnerable.
And also, I mean, among those options and opportunities that people should have, we should also include, I mean, this is more of my socialist side talking, but I mean, I guess it's also important to have strong workers' rights. And I know that many people on the right don't like this concept at all, but I'm going to use it anyway. Having actual living wages. I mean, because you don't need to be a doctor or someone with any kind with an equivalent career or profession. I mean, people should be able to work any job and be able to pay at the very least their basic bills. Right.
Yeah, I think Nordic countries then have been a splendid natural experiment showing that success. In the Nordic countries, the unions have been strong, so that this has happened here. But then again, you will always have the problem of the young male syndrome and how ambitious young boys and men can be, and it's all fair enough for you and I to say, you know, just having basic needs met. No, not everyone has to be a doctor and a lawyer, but young men are different from you and I. Young men are so ambitious that if they can have a job where, you know, you can pay all your bills, it's fine kind of thing, you know, one holiday each other year, you should be happy with that. A young man isn't. That's the young male syndrome, wanting more. And being willing to take risks. And again, like I'm repeating myself, but it makes them very vulnerable when then someone introduces them to an alternative. And the alternative is always illegal.
Yeah. Yeah, and by the way, just before we move on to abortion, because at a certain point, I mean, we have to talk about abortion because this is, I mean, the states are just pissing me off with recent developments. But yeah, just before that, I wanted to comment on something that you said there at a certain point. You mentioned people getting annoyed or upset by you and other people studying these issues from an evolutionary perspective, for example. Yeah. And I mean, it's not just that you are just trying to understand, explain these kinds of behaviors, but we need those explanations to prevent these kinds of behaviors, right? I mean, I'm not even trying to play some sort of tribalistic war here and say that evolutionary psychology is the only game in town. I mean, it might come from a developmental perspective, you might come from the perspective of sociology. It doesn't matter. I mean, and we need all of those perspectives.
Yes.
But either it doesn't matter. It doesn't really matter the perspective you come from. You're still trying to understand the behavior, and again, we need that understanding to prevent as best as we can those behaviors from occurring. Right.
Yeah, we need an accurate, valid, realistic understanding of human nature. so that we don't fall into the traps of saying, well, if a woman has killed her child, she must be mentally ill. Or saying, well, no wonder a man killed his child. I mean, men are violent. I mean, we've had these very odd ideas of human nature, such as the more time you spend with a child, the more likely you are to hit it and kill it. No, not in a species so dependent on spending all your time with a child. Yeah, so you have to have a realistic understanding, and well, like in my years of study, I mean, I've got undergraduate studies in, I mean, psychology, criminology, biology. I have a master's both in criminology and in psychology, two separate masters, and a PhD then in evolutionary psychology. So, I mean, I've been through all the theories, and it's not that. You know, people who believe in a social learning model of human behavior, right? Mm-hmm. They can take offense of that I'm an evolutionary psychologist, which is just weird and odd. But they will take offense. And then they will ask me, well, don't you think any behavior is socially learned? And I'll say, yes, no, of course it is. Of course it is. But the ability to socially learn behavior is only there if it had an evolutionary function. Mm-hmm. So to understand why some behaviors you will socially learn much quicker than others, we have to bring in a little bit of an evolutionary understanding of, to get a realistic understanding of human nature. Why do we have social learning at all, and why is it that some behaviors more than others can be, is malleable, can be formed by it, and why is it no matter how much social learning you throw at a phenomenon, you're not getting rid of it?
Yeah.
And also like sociology that looks at, sociology has been critical to understanding on a population level why certain groups are more vulnerable than others. But again, they are saying something about human nature here. If you say that it's not, if you say it is poverty, you're saying something about human nature when poor humans will.
Yeah, basically you're saying...
you're also saying something.
Yeah, basically you're saying when humans are exposed to these conditions, X happens, right?
And so you're saying something about human nature, and then it's lost on me why you wouldn't want to educate yourself on how nature evolves. Mm-hmm. Because we're all saying something about human nature. It's just that some of us are more explicit than others and more educated than others on what nature is and how nature evolves. For instance, by reading the works of Robert Trivers or Hamilton, and then explicitly using that as a theoretical guide to do our research. Like there is absolutely homicide research out there that disaggregates between homicides and homicide-suicides, and then looks for, is there anything, what's typical of the one and the other? What makes them different and what makes them similar? But they haven't got a theoretical foundation for making that disaggregation. Whereas with an evolutionary approach, which I'm part of developing theoretically along with the empirical evidence for it, is that there is scientific, theoretical reason to expect there to be differences. Differences in the psychological mechanism triggering these two different types of homicide, and also therefore also the characteristic traits of perpetrators, victims, circumstances will necessarily both be predictable. If the hypothesis is correct, it will be predictable and systematic. Mm-hmm. So I don't know why people so strong-headedly are denying the theoretical and empirical development in their subjects, because they have this emotional response to the idea of using an evolutionary approach, because we all want the same thing. Yeah. We want to understand human nature so that we can improve our conditions.
Yeah. And also, I mean, that's more of the intellectual dispute here, but also something that doesn't really help at all, and it's probably even worse than those disputes, is just people saying, oh, that man or that woman did that because he is bad or he's evil. And I'm like, okay, but the only thing that tells me is that you yourself live in a society with norms against that kind of behavior. And look, more power to you, that's excellent, but I'm not learning anything about the person who committed that type of crime, because that's just moralizing. So I'm not learning anything. The person is bad, the person is evil. Yeah, and what does that mean?
Because they're defined as that because they performed that specific action. But yeah, you know absolutely no more on how to prevent, how to buffer. Nope, you still don't know. So now what? So yeah, no, they're just describing by referring to like historically current norms, because there are societies where, you know, killing an unfaithful partner was accepted. Societies where not wanting to provide for a stepchild was accepted. So
Yeah.
now what? So you've described the norms of your current culture, but you haven't said something about human nature, because in larger parts of our history, we were performing these behaviors without much moral judgment.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't get me wrong. I love norms. I love
Hey,
norms.
I love dogs as well.
But but
I don't want to live in anarchy. I do not want to
but
live in anarchy.
yeah,
As a female, I do not want to live in anarchy. I
and
want
and
laws.
with all the caveats we mentioned earlier when we were talking about publicly condemning people who have not been proven to be guilty. With all those caveats in mind, yeah, if someone has been proven guilty, shame that bastard. Okay, fine. If those norms work, fine. But again, I'm not learning anything new about or anything more about criminal behavior by just hearing people calling someone evil or bad. So
Yeah.
okay, so getting into abortion then. Oh my God. So, I mean, I wanted to ask you about, because there have been some studies, and I guess that most of them are from the 90s. I don't know if there are newer studies or replications out there that linked access to abortion to lower criminality, and I guess that the link there was
Yeah.
the link was mostly if women, mothers who live in dire conditions, who live in poverty, etc., have access to abortion, then there would be fewer kids, mostly males, I guess, that would be growing up in those conditions that would lead them to criminal behavior. I think this was mostly the link. I mean, is that true, or is that something that's been debunked?
It's theoretically sound. Theoretically sound, because it's absolutely true. There are other things that can of course help besides from abortion, like for instance, I mean, these numbers will have been produced in, for instance, the States, you know, and they've got other issues there, like not necessarily helping single mothers to the extent that one does in, for instance, the Nordic countries. The financial help, the lack of social stigma, etc., that you have in the Nordic countries versus in certain states of America.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of factors playing in, but yeah, women know what they're doing when they're having abortions. I think that's a claim that bears repeating, so I will. Women know what they're doing when they're having an abortion. They know what they're doing. They know that they won't be able to care for that child. They know.
And I mean, we really have to stress, because this is really a point that many people on the right bring to the table. Women do not go for abortions lightly. I mean, that's not a decision that they make lightly. No one does that. I mean,
It's not.
that's just a myth that some
Yeah,
people on the right keep bringing to the table
and it's a
to suggest that, oh, if abortion is legal, then everyone will be using abortion as a contraceptive measure. I mean, that's absurd. From an
that's
evolutionary perspective, that
yeah,
makes absolutely no sense at
no
all.
sense. It is absurd, and one can make a joke about what horrible women they have in their lives. You know, I'd hate to meet your mum. When someone says that, if that's their idea of female psychology, but yeah, academically, one can also say that there's absolutely no sound theoretical, no empirical basis for that claim. Um, there's research showing, because on the right wing, because it is often right wing arguments against this.
Yeah.
Uh, not that the liberals are wanting to force abortion on women.
Okay, come on, that's
There
another.
is a difference
Yeah.
between those sides in politics, but
Yeah.
the right wing, they're also the ones that are, and we spoke about this last. They're also the ones who are withholding more on helping women who are single mothers. The quicker to judge single mothers and not wanting to help them, you know, with the state state provided child welfare. So they're wanting to like force women into not being good mothers and also having a society that doesn't help that mother.
Yeah.
So they are creating a horrid situation on both accounts, which undermines the credibility of them saying we have to think of the children, because obviously you're not. You're wanting it to live, but then you want it to live in poverty with a mother who can't care for it. This is not an argument for just getting rid of the abortion and then having like these 1950s ideas of the good mother and like, you know, forcing women to be good mothers after a 1950s model. Not arguing for that either. I just want to repeat: women know what they're doing when they decide to have an abortion. That's the best solution. So I think one should trust women more, and not some countries. Norway has had it under certain circumstances. Under certain circumstances, before getting the abortion, the woman has to meet a board of people who have to listen to her plead and reasoning, and then they make the final decision. I think that's absolutely grotesque. I think that is absolutely grotesque. A woman knows what she's doing, but I am. Jokes aside, I'm not going to joke about the mums of these people, but they do have a rather disturbing idea of women as, I don't know, feeble-minded, that women are backward and they can't make this decision on their own, and we have to make the decision for them, and that if you let women decide, they'll just be, gleefully murderous.
Yeah.
And it's just completely unrecognizable, as a woman, as a human being, as a homicide researcher, as an evolutionary psychologist. I don't know what they're talking about.
Yeah. And also, I mean, since they come from a conservative point of view, and many times people make just silly statements or claims about how life in traditional societies is, just to reinforce the position that, oh, we should live traditionally and all of that. I mean, if you look into anthropology particularly, you also get to learn that actually, again, going back to norms, just because you live in a society with Judeo-Christian morality that condemns abortion, I mean, that's not exactly historically and traditionally the same in human societies, because even in societies where you don't have sort of medical drugs to perform for abortion to occur. I mean, you have access to other things like, I don't know, chemicals coming from plants or whatever to induce abortion. And I mean, if women do not have good enough conditions to have a baby and to take care of it and rear it, and they do not have any other alternative, traditionally they resort to abortion one way or the other. That's basically what I'm saying. It's not something that liberal people in the West suddenly invented.
No,
Right.
and also traditional societies and norms changing, etc., is that when you don't have the possibility to abort, whether by modern medicine or other sorts of medicine, or not to be able to abort by any means, what you have is you have increased rates of neonaticide. That's when the child gets born within the first 24 hours. And historically, that's been the largest child homicide category. Neonaticide has been the largest, performed then by women who can't take care of this child for reasons such as, you know, she doesn't have resources, or she'll be ostracized from her family.
Yeah.
The pregnancy occurred outside a relationship or with an unwilling partner, unwilling with regards to investing. Again, she knows what she's doing. And so the States has had the highest rates of neonaticide in modern time, whereas other countries who have been more progressive and liberal have seen a great decrease in these numbers. And again, the Nordic countries are excelling. And I have an article published back in 2012 saying how it appears that we currently have an absence of neonaticide in Norway. And we had, even to the extent, the appearance of an absence of neonaticide currently in modern day Norway due to abortion, sex ed, education, preventive measures, the social stigma being gotten rid of, blah, 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 with the Nordic countries, a natural experiment showing that with all of these opportunities that women now have to control if, when, with whom, etc., they become mothers, neonaticide declines. And you see that in the whole westernized world, but you're not seeing it as clearly in the States because they keep doing whatever they can to prevent women from sex education, preventive measures, and abortion. Because you also see now with these different states struggling with, are women still allowed to have an abortion or not, as the federal right was removed. Now it's on state level. The same states that are trying to prevent women from having abortions are also trying to prevent sex education, also trying to prevent access to birth control. Yeah, it's the same states. And no, it's absolutely awful. It's absolutely awful. And I don't know why American researchers haven't pointed out the obvious, you know, child homicide researchers, that if we do this, we might also have an increase. I mean, yeah, you'll have an increase with women having doing illegal measures and convictions of these women, and you'll have medical complications, and the women will die, and children might die. But no one has said yet. So I wrote an opinion piece back in Norway, which is in English on my blog, that you might actually in these states also see an increase in neonaticide. Women who haven't been able to prevent getting pregnant, haven't been able to prevent the birth through abortion, and so then have the child give birth to the child, but are still in that desperate situation. Like you said, the situation hasn't changed. It's just the legal measures have. And so now they're committing neonaticide, and so you'll have an increase of that, and with that an increase of imprisonment, harsh imprisonment in the States. The States are harsh against women perpetrating neonaticide. Many other countries, it started in the UK, and other countries followed up back in the 1800s on having a more lenient approach to women committing neonaticide, appreciating, having a humane perspective on appreciating the dire situation these often young women were, not being able to take over the kids, and therefore having it prescribed in the laws that these women should be punished less severely. Whereas the states didn't do that. And some states then can go wild with the prison sentence against these poor women. And of course, there's going to be class differences in what women can go to a different state, in what women can obtain the safest illegal measures, etc. There's going to be class differences, and within class, you also have some social minorities that are going to be more vulnerable than the white majority. Yeah, and it's a modern day horror show to watch.
Yeah, and by the way, this will probably be my last comment/question for this interview, because we've been going on for a while now.
We always do this.
Yeah, and I don't mind at all. It's just that I'm a bit worried also about taking too much of your time. But anyway, also, and this is probably something that an evolutionary perspective might help us get a better understanding of, and being a little bit more empathetic, I guess, because I mean, just imagine, and I'm not a woman, so I won't ever go through these sorts of issues, but still, I can put myself in a situation where I would want to do something with my body that I'm not allowed to do, and yeah, I can very easily imagine a situation like that. But just imagine how horrific it must be for a woman to not have the necessary conditions to have a child, and getting pregnant, and then around her nobody being willing to help her end that pregnancy. I mean, that must be one of the worst things that could happen to you. I mean, for me personally, it's very easy to imagine even someone having suicidal ideation because of that. I mean, it's awful. It's awful.
It's why I use the phrase it's a modern day horror show, absolutely horror show. To like, I mean, you mention everything that is then important from an evolutionary perspective. To have control over your body, to have control over when, who, if you get pregnant, if you have a child, to have the possibility to be a good mother, and to not go through, not you or not the child going through you being a bad mother. No, it's a modern day horror show, and it's so abundantly clear to the rest of us that this isn't really thought through, and the argument of, but I'm thinking about the child when you're trying to restrict women in this way is it's not credible. It is not credible.
I mean, it's even less credible. I mean, George Carlin had a stand-up segment about this. I mean, the pro-life people, realistically speaking, only care about the life of the child until he or she comes out of the womb. Because after that, I don't see many far right-wing people caring about child support. And I mean, even, oh my God, this is awful. But even in the States, there are people who don't want for children to have free lunches at school. So come on, you're not getting away with that kind of argument. That's not credible at all. You don't care about the child, you just care about the fetus. And someone probably will quote me on this. Anyway, yeah.
Can I ask a question to you? Talking about abortion as we are, as frankly as we are, and our attitude, etc., are you going to get a lot of hate mail?
Well, I mean, I guess I will probably get some hate comments on the video. That's more frequently the case. I remember, and yeah, we have to wrap up the interview, but just to mention this briefly, I had an interview back in 2021 with Francesca Minerva, who is one of the founders of the Journal of Controversial Ideas in Philosophy. And we were talking about, back in 2012, she made a philosophical, moral philosophy argument for what she called post-birth abortion, which basically infanticide. Making an argument for, at least to a certain point, if we look into the neuroscience and the cognitive science, supposedly the kid hasn't developed yet certain psychological capacities, and so if you would kill it, it wouldn't be that much. Of course, this is a very, very controversial argument, and Peter Singer also supports that kind of argument. But that's beside the point. I did that interview. I released the interview, and then I got a comment there of a guy, I guess it was a guy, but basically condemning me to burn in hell. So it was, very obviously a religious person at the very least.
In hell, and that hell is a place that burns. Yeah.
So yeah, I might get something like that in this interview. I'm not sure.
Well, we're not there, because what I'm telling you is that if you remove the opportunity for abortion, what you'll get is an increase of those post-birth, as in what we actually then call neonaticide, killing the newborn. So if you want to avoid that, you should allow for abortions, and they have to be safe, legal, accessible. Accessible means that it shouldn't be, if women aren't having abortions because they can't afford them, well, they're not going to be able to afford the child, are they? And so in Norway, it's the state healthcare system that pays for the abortion. So that's a part of the picture. If you want to have an increase in neonaticide, by all means, remove women's ability to have free, legal, safe abortions. But if you want to remove neonaticide, abortion, along with a list of other things, is what you need to.
Yeah. Also, just for potential commentators, please work a little bit more on your insults, because I'm not a religious person. So just telling me to burn in hell, I'm all for it. So.
If one doesn't believe in an afterlife, the idea of burning in an imaginary one is not terrifying. But I don't think we've had horrible comments. I haven't checked in a while, but I don't think you and I have had any horrible comments. But let's see.
Yeah. Okay. So just quickly, would you like to tell people again where they can find you and your work on the internet?
Oh, I always get terrified when you ask me this question. No, I don't want people to find me.
Find you is basically social media and stuff like that.
Don't find me. I am on Twitter. I don't know if Twitter still is a thing.
I'm also not sure what its name is right now, because supposedly it's X, but it's Twitter. But I don't know anymore.
But I'm there as Biosocial. So Biosocial, but without the C, it's an S. Which is also the name of my scholarly blog, which I'm never updating. Otherwise, you'll find me on ResearchGate, I think is the safest place, because, find me on ResearchGate.
At least there's no Elon Musk there.
See, number one, he's not there. Two, he's not there dancing. So, win-win so far. I don't think there's a lot of hate crime on ResearchGate. So, I think find me there, find my publications there. Not all of them are openly accessible of my publications, But when possible, I have open publications. And the neonaticide article is there, the one from 2012 on neonaticide, and the Nordic countries being an experiment and what works and what doesn't, and its association with abortion, and the systematic differences between those child homicides with and without an association with perpetrator psychopathology. You'll also find there, and a list of other works that one might have to then pay for getting access to, but like where I discuss the more sympathetic sides of the male psychology that is underpinning their homicides. Work describing how women aren't pathological, but are following an adaptive logic when they perpetrate child homicide, including then neonaticide. So one can find me on ResearchGate, I think, is the safest place. But no, I always get on edge when you ask, where can people find you? I'm like, no, don't. I don't need to be found.
Well, let me just tell you that you're not the only one. In fact, I have several interviews where this was the most horrifying.
Is it? Okay, so I'm not just weird and high-strung.
No, not at all. Not at all.
Okay.
Okay,
well,
so
I am high-strung, but I'm not the only one who is.
Yeah. Okay, so thank you so much again for your time, and it's always lots of fun to talk to you.
Always such a pleasure. Thank you so much for letting me reach your audience. I'm surprised and flattered that you have me on at all, let alone a third time. And thank you for your patience with my very pubescent little English bull terrier. He's a lovely thing, but not when he's awake.
Yeah. No, he made for a great companion. So
there's always more blood, a greater body count, and a new character in a sequel. So I think we tick the boxes.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for having me, and take.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please do not forget to like it, share, comment, and subscribe. And if you like more generally what I'm doing, please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. You have all of the links in the description of this interview. This show is brought to you by Enlights Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Erge Larsen, Jerry Muller, Hans Fredrik Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Visser, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Henrik Alenia, John Connors, Philip Force Connolly, Robert Windager, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Simon Columbus, Phil Kavanagh, Mikkel Stormir, Samuel Andreev, Francis Ford, Tiago Dunes, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Librant, João Linhares, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Weira, Tom Hummel, Sardus France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correa, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stazewski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Hallman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Panos Cortez, Ursula Litska, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Morten Eikeland, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Loaki, Georgios Theophanos, Chris Williamson, Peter Olsen, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Amaury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry Dealey Jr., Holt Ericbun, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Gressis, Tom Roth, DRPMD, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Richard Bowen, Thomas Dobner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Manuel Oliveira, Kimberly Johnson, and Benjamin Galbart. A special thanks to my producers, Cesar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Hugni, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Robert Lewis, and Al Nick Ortiz, and to my executive producers, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadrian, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.